They always said I took things too personally. And maybe I did. But when your heart beats like a wounded bird in your chest, fluttering, struggling, reminding you that it's borrowed time you're living on, you tend to feel life a little deeper than most. My name is Eron, and by the time I turned 35, I'd already had 3 minor cardiac episodes and one stern doctor who looked me dead in the eye and said, "You need to avoid stress, Eron. Anything painful. You wear it like armor, and your heart's not made for war." But the truth is, I loved my life. Or at least I tried to. I had a decent job as a technical editor, a small but warm home on the edge of town, and a wife who used to smile at me like I was her favorite song. Her name was Marla. She was sharp, funny, the kind of woman who remembered birthdays and always knew which friend needed a phone call. I used to tell people I hit the jackpot, and for a long time I believed it. Our mornings were quiet rituals. She liked jasmine tea. I drank black coffee. I'd sit at the kitchen table, tapping away at a manuscript, while she hummed some half-remembered tune from her childhood. The sunlight through the window hit her hair just right, and I'd steal glances, thinking, this is enough, this is good. But something started shifting, not all at once, not dramatically, like the slow way leaves change before fall. You don't notice until the colors are gone. She started laughing at her phone more often. Texts she wouldn't explain, late night just going for a walk moments. I wanted to ask, to pull the threads and unravel whatever had started knitting itself between us. But every time I looked at her, I remembered what the doctor said. Don't create stress. Don't push too hard. So I smiled. I kept making her tea. I told myself, maybe it's work. Maybe she's just in a different season. Then came the name. Eli. She said it casually one evening over dinner, like he'd always been in the story. Eli from the gallery thinks I should try painting again. Oh, I said. Gallery. Yeah, that small one downtown. I met him at lunch with Callie last week. He's interesting, encouraging, just someone who gets the creative itch. That night I Googled him. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to see what kind of man encouraged married women to pick up brushes again. He looked normal, handsome in a quiet way, older than me by a few years. Beard, dark eyes, a way of leaning into the camera like he knew how to listen. I hated him instantly. Still, I said nothing. I told myself, Eron, don't make something out of nothing. Trust her. That's what love is, right? But trusting doesn't mean you stop noticing. You notice everything. The extra care she put into her makeup before leaving the house. The way her phone never left her hand. How she stopped asking about my heart meds. How she stopped asking about anything, really. There's a particular kind of ache that settles in a man's chest when the woman he adores starts giving her best self to someone else. And when your literal heart is already failing, the metaphor hits different. I started walking more, just to clear my head. I took up photography again. Found joy in small things. The perfect light on a rainy morning. The sound of kids playing down the street. I wasn't going to beg for affection. I wasn't going to demand answers. If she wanted space, I'd give her galaxies. One evening, I came home to find her in the backyard, on the phone, whispering. She turned when she saw me. Just Eli, she said. He's going through some stuff. I was helping him talk it out. I nodded. I even smiled. My chest burned, but I smiled. Later that night, I lay awake listening to her breathe beside me, and I wondered when she stopped listening to me. I still told her I loved her every day. She said it back, but it felt like someone else was speaking through her, like her voice was a recording from better times. I didn't have evidence. I didn't want it. Maybe because I feared what it would do to my body if I had to live with that kind of truth. But bodies know what minds try to deny. My blood pressure spiked. I began having dizzy spells. The cardiologist adjusted my meds and told me to rest more, stress less, eat better, sleep deeper. I nodded, knowing I was doing the opposite. Because how do you rest when your home isn't safe anymore? How do you sleep when you dream of the woman you love walking into someone else's arms? But even then, I held on. I told myself, this is a phase. You've been through worse. She's just lost in her own life, not in someone else's. Then came the night she didn't come home. She said she was out late painting at Eli's studio. And for the first time, I didn't say anything at all. I just nodded. I waited until she went to bed, then walked out onto the porch. I looked up at the stars, feeling the tremor in my chest. A small flutter, like a bird trying to escape a closed room. "Don't leave me," I whispered. I wasn't talking to her. I was talking to my heart. It whispered back with silence. And I knew even before I had proof that the woman I loved had left me long before she ever packed a bag. You don't notice the exact moment a breeze turns into a storm. Not until the trees are bent, the windows rattling, and everything you built starts to tremble. That's what it felt like in my house, a storm without thunder tearing things apart quietly. The next morning, Marla made pancakes. She hadn't made pancakes in 6 months. I watched her hum as she flipped them, pouring syrup onto a plate like she hadn't just spent the night in another man's orbit. "You sleep okay?" she asked, sliding a plate in front of me. I wanted to say, "No. I haven't slept in weeks." I said, "Yeah. You." She smiled. "Didn't get much. Creative nights are like that." Creative. That's what she called it. I stared at the syrup running across the pancake, dark and slow, thinking it looked like something bleeding. I stopped eating pancakes that day. From then on, she became a master illusionist. Present but absent. Laughing but distant. Her phone became an extension of her body. She guarded it like a diary full of dangerous truths. I became a spectator in my own marriage. One night, I heard her in the hallway talking softly. I pressed my ear to the door. "No, he doesn't suspect anything. No, he's just tired lately. The heart stuff, you know?" She knew I was struggling, but she used it as camouflage. The next day, I began journaling everything. Not because I wanted revenge. I just wanted clarity. Proof that I wasn't losing my mind. I kept track of dates, times, excuses, expressions. I became my own investigator, quietly gathering pieces of a puzzle no one else could see. Then came the lie that broke something inside me. "I'm going to Cali's for the weekend," she said. "Girls' getaway. Spa, wine, no boys allowed." I nodded. "Sounds fun." She kissed my cheek and packed a bag. But her toothbrush was missing the next morning, not the travel one, the one from our bathroom. And she took the necklace I gave her on our 5th anniversary. The one she said she only wore when she wanted to feel loved. Callie posted photos from the spa. Marla wasn't in any of them. Instead, I saw her in someone else's, Eli's Instagram. A blurry background shot, but I knew her hands, the way she tucked her hair. She was at his cabin. In the mountains. My heart gave a warning thump. I sat down before it knocked me flat. Still, I didn't confront her. Not yet. Some part of me needed to see how far she'd go. Not to punish her. Just to know the limits of her love. Or lack of them. I started carrying nitroglycerin again. I hadn't needed it in years. At night, I began talking to myself quietly under my breath. Asking questions I didn't want answers to. Why wasn't I enough? When did I stop being her favorite place? What did Eli give her that I couldn't? And why, even after all this, did I still love her? Because I did. God help me, I did. Some nights, she came home smelling of paint and lavender. Others, she came home looking drained but lit from within. That was the look that killed me. The glow she used to save for me. I never asked. And she never told. Until one night, I came home early from a checkup. The doctor wanted to monitor a new arrhythmia. I walked in quietly, hoping to surprise her. And I did. She was on the couch, whispering into her phone, eyes closed. "I wish I could just stay with you," she said. "It's so hard pretending." I backed away, walked out the front door, and sat on the porch for 2 hours. I didn't cry. My body wouldn't allow it. I think it knew I couldn't afford to break. That night, I slept in the guest room. She didn't ask why. The wind had changed. And part of me knew it wasn't going to blow my way again. I don't know when the word friend lost its innocence. Maybe it was the moment she used it to describe a man whose cologne I could smell on her scarf, or maybe it was when I saw his name light up her screen while she was in the shower, Eli. That name stopped sounding casual a long time ago. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I ran into Eli. Pure coincidence. I was picking up my new blood pressure meds at the corner pharmacy when he walked in with a canvas under his arm and a half-eaten sandwich in hand. He looked surprised to see me. I guess he didn't expect the husband to still be around. "Eron, right?" he said too confidently. I nodded. "Eli." We stood in silence for a beat. He looked at me the way someone looks at a sick dog, with pity, not concern. "Marla talks about you. She said you've been unwell." "I have a heart condition," I said. "Doesn't mean I'm dead." He smiled, thin and uncomfortable. "Of course not." I wanted to ask him how long, how deep, was it worth it? But instead I just said, "Take care of yourself," and walked out. That was the moment I realized I wasn't even angry. Not in the way people imagine, fists slamming walls, voices raised. No, my betrayal came wrapped in numbness. And that scared me more. Over the next few weeks, the tension in our home became a silent roommate. It slept on the couch, ate from our plates, hovered over every conversation. I started to distance myself, not to punish her, but to protect myself. Every smile she gave me felt borrowed. Every touch came a second too late. One night, she brought home takeout and set it on the table like we were still us. "Eli says I should show my work at the gallery's summer showcase," she said casually, stabbing a dumpling. "Of course he does," I replied. She paused, eyes narrowing. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing. Just that he seems very encouraging." She sighed like I was being unreasonable. "He believes in me. That's all." I wanted to ask if she believed in me. In us. Instead, I ate in silence. I started seeing a therapist on Thursdays. Her name was Rena. Kind eyes, soft voice, and the rare ability to let silence do the talking. She didn't push. "What's keeping you in the marriage?" she asked one session. "Hope," I said. "And history. And your health." "My heart's broken either way." She didn't flinch. "Have you thought about asking her to be honest with you?" "She's already told me everything. Just not with words." I left her office that day with a question ringing in my ears. What would it look like to let go with grace? One Friday evening, Marla came home glowing. Her cheeks were flushed, and her smile lingered like she'd just come from somewhere beautiful. "I had lunch with Eli," she said. "He thinks I should travel. Paint in new places. Do you think so?" She looked at me, really looked at me, and for a second I saw the girl I fell in love with. "I don't know anymore." I nodded. "Neither do I." We didn't speak for the rest of the night. Then came the moment of clarity. I found her journal. Not that I went looking, it was open on the coffee table, pages fluttering from the ceiling fan. The handwriting I knew by heart, scrawled in looping emotion. "I don't want to hurt him, but I'm already hurting him. Every day. I don't know how to stay, but I'm terrified of leaving a man who still tells me I'm beautiful when I haven't felt it in years." I closed the book gently. That night, I wrote her a letter. I didn't confront her. I didn't accuse her. I told her I saw her, that I loved her, that I knew, and I told her she didn't have to pretend anymore. I left the letter on her pillow and went for a walk. The moon was full. My chest felt like it had a hole in it, but it was also the first time in months that it didn't feel heavy. When I got home, she was sitting on the edge of the bed, eyes red. "You knew." "I did. Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I was waiting for you to say something first." She cried, and I held her. Not as a husband begging for a second chance, but as a man saying goodbye. We didn't end things that night, but something broke gently like the sound of paper tearing. And for the first time, I realized sometimes grace isn't in holding on. It's in letting go, with dignity, with love, and with the quiet understanding that even a broken heart can still beat beautifully. There's a moment, not when something breaks, but right before, where you know what's coming. You hear the creak before the fall, the breath before the confession. That's where I lived for weeks. Right in that moment. Suspended. Waiting for the fracture. After the letter, we drifted like two leaves caught in the same slow current. Still in the same home, sharing meals, small talk, routines, but no longer married in the way that mattered. Marla didn't leave. Not right away. Maybe she didn't know how. Maybe she thought staying meant trying. But love without depth is like painting with water, the colors fade too fast. One morning, I found her staring at a blank canvas. She hadn't touched her brushes in days. "You used to love painting," I said quietly. "I used to love a lot of things," she replied, I still fixed forward. I wanted to tell her I understood. That sometimes grief looks like disinterest. But instead, I sat down beside her. We didn't talk. We just let the silence be something sacred. I started sleeping better, not because I was at peace, but because I was exhausted from pretending. My heart would race at night, then slow in the mornings like it wasn't sure what it was supposed to do. My cardiologist changed my meds again. He looked at my charts, frowned, and asked if I was under unusual stress. No more than usual, I said with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. He didn't push. He just nodded and wrote something down. Marla began packing in pieces. A drawer here. A suitcase half-filled. Not the rush of someone fleeing, but the methodical steps of someone leaving a life behind slowly enough to not notice they're doing it. One Sunday afternoon she said, "I think I'm going to stay with Callie for a few weeks." I nodded. Okay. She hesitated. Is that all you're going to say? What would you like me to say? I don't know. Ask me to stay. I looked at her then, really looked, and said, if you wanted to stay, you wouldn't be leaving. She blinked, then nodded. Fair. She left the next morning. Quietly. No fight. No tears. Just the soft sound of a door closing behind her. I stood in the hallway listening to the silence echo. I wish I could say life got better after that. That I found freedom or strength or peace. But what I found was space. And space is a double-edged thing. It gives you room to breathe, but it also reminds you of everything that used to fill it. I cooked for one. Took slower walks. Watched the same documentaries I used to fall asleep to on nights she stayed out late. I made the bed every morning, her side untouched. Friends began calling more. Checking in. I could hear it in their voices. They knew something had shifted even if I hadn't said a word. I told them I was fine. And for a while, that lie was easier than the truth. One afternoon, Rena, my therapist, asked, "What does healing look like to you?" I thought about it. It looks like breathing without wondering if it'll be my last. She nodded. And emotionally? It looks like remembering her without breaking. She smiled gently. Then let's work toward that. Weeks passed. Then months. Marla didn't come back. She didn't ask to. And I didn't reach out. But one morning a letter arrived. Not a text. Not an email. A real, handwritten letter. Her handwriting. It read, *Eron. I don't know how to begin except to say I'm sorry. I didn't mean to fall out of love with you. I didn't plan it. And maybe that's the cruelest part, that it wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. A shift I didn't fight. You were always good to me. Too good, maybe. And I took that goodness and treated it like it would never run out. But it did. Or I did. I hope you find peace. I hope your heart finds rest. And I hope you know that even in the end, part of me will always love you, not the way you deserve, but the only way I could. Marla. *. I sat with that letter for hours. Folded it. Unfolded it. Read it again. Not because I was searching for something. Just because I didn't know what else to do with it. I didn't reply. Instead, I walked to the park. The one we used to go to before everything changed. I sat on the same bench. Watched the same fountain. And for the first time I let myself cry. Not out of anger. Not out of heartbreak. Out of release. Sometimes unraveling isn't destruction. Sometimes it's just the start of becoming something new. After Marla's letter, I boxed it away, not to forget it, but to keep it somewhere I wouldn't trip over it every time I opened a drawer. Closure doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives in quiet choices. I began going through old photos. Not out of nostalgia, but to decide what I wanted to remember. It's strange how a smile can look different once you know what came after it. Still, I didn't delete them. They weren't lies, they were just old truths. One evening, I received an email from a mutual friend of ours, Dave, from Marla's art circle. He had no idea we'd separated. He was forwarding an invitation to a gallery showcase. Marla's name was on the list. I opened the flyer, and there she was, standing next to Eli, smiling under soft lights. Her painting was in the background, abstract and loud. Beautiful, if I'm being honest. But it felt like a stranger had painted it. My chest tightened. Not with jealousy. Just a hollow recognition. She had moved on. I didn't go to the show. Instead, I went to the pier, the place where Marla once told me she loved me for the first time. The benches had been replaced. The lampposts were brighter. But the ocean hadn't changed. I stood at the edge and whispered, "You loved me once." Not out of bitterness. Just remembrance. That week, Rena asked if I felt like I had closure. I said, "Closure's a funny word. It sounds like something final, but I think it's more like a door you stop trying to open." She nodded. "And have you stopped?" "I think I have." Then something unexpected happened. A neighbor, Mrs. Farley, came by with a package that had been mistakenly delivered to her house. It was addressed to me, but the sender's name caught my eye: Private Investigator Services, LLC. I hadn't hired one. But weeks before everything fell apart, I had contacted a service online just to ask. No payment, no follow-up. Just a curious, desperate man clicking through forms late one night. Apparently, they'd run a preliminary scan anyway. The envelope contained a thin report. And photos. My hands trembled as I read. Dates. Times. Images of Marla entering and leaving Eli's building. Not once. Not twice. Regularly. Overlapping with the times she'd said she was elsewhere. I didn't need proof anymore. But there it was. I sat on the couch with the report in my lap for over an hour. Not angry. Just quiet. Proof doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just sits beside you like an old friend confirming what your gut always knew. I burned it. Not out of rage. But because I didn't need the past to hold me hostage. I let the ashes scatter in the fireplace, then made myself a cup of tea. That night, I slept without dreams. In the following days, I began donating things. Not just hers, mine too. Things we bought together. Things that belonged to a different version of me. The house began to feel like mine again. Not ours. The silence changed too. It no longer echoed with questions. It simply rested. I found the strength to attend a gathering a few friends hosted. It had been months. I laughed more than I expected. No one asked about Marla. Maybe they knew. Maybe they didn't. Either way, I was grateful. Then, one afternoon, while sorting through a drawer, I found the old heart monitor I used to wear. I held it in my hand, remembering the nights Marla would check it, her eyes scanning the numbers, pretending not to worry. I didn't cry. But I did place it back in the drawer gently. Because some memories don't need to be erased. They just need to be honored and left in peace. Endings rarely announce themselves. They show up dressed like routines, wearing your old clothes, sitting in your usual chair. I didn't know it that morning, but I was preparing for the kind of goodbye that doesn't need a door to close. I woke up early, made the bed, and opened the windows to let the air in. The spring breeze carried that damp earth smell like something in the ground was stirring. I made breakfast, eggs, toast, and coffee. The silence of the house didn't feel sharp anymore. Just present. Marla hadn't reached out in weeks. I hadn't either. Some connections don't snap, they fray until you forget what they were tying together in the first place. Later that day, Rena called. I keep thinking about something you said last week, she told me. You weren't afraid of being alone, you were afraid of being forgotten. I didn't respond right away. You've spent so much time keeping pain quiet, Eron. What would it look like to give it a voice? After we hung up, I sat down at my desk, opened an old leather notebook, and started writing. Not to Marla. Not even about her. Just about everything: growing up, being sick, falling in love, falling apart. The story wasn't clean. But it was mine. That same week, I saw her. Marla. At the grocery store of all places. She was near the produce section, wearing the same green coat she used to wear when we'd walk the dog in winter. She was holding a bag of strawberries and a bottle of white wine. I was holding toothpaste and tea. Eron, she said, blinking in surprise. Marla. We stood there, surrounded by apples and lemons, like people auditioning for a scene they didn't rehearse. You look good, she said. You look tired, I replied. Then, realizing how it sounded, I added, but still you. She smiled. Life's been a little blurry lately. We talked for maybe 3 minutes. Nothing earth-shaking. She asked about my health. I told her I was managing. She said she was staying busy, but that it didn't always help. I miss talking, she finally said. I nodded. We said everything already. Just not all out loud. Then she asked, softly, would you ever want to talk again? I gave it a beat. No, I said gently. But I hope you find peace. She swallowed hard. I hope you do too. We left in opposite directions. Back home, I turned that scene over in my mind again and again. But every time I did, it felt softer, not heavier. I went upstairs, pulled out an old suitcase, and began folding clothes into it. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I didn't want to be there, not in that house, not in that version of myself. I drove along the coast for days. Stopped in towns so small they didn't have traffic lights. I stayed in quiet places. Motels that smelled of pine cleaner and carried the sound of waves in the walls. At one inn, the owner asked if I was traveling for work. No, I said. Just passing through. And for the first time, that answer didn't feel like an escape. It felt like the truth. Every night, I wrote. About things that didn't seem important but felt real, a child chasing birds by a pier, an old man feeding stray cats behind a gas station, a couple arguing in a cafe over whether to buy curtains. My heart still fluttered sometimes. I still had to take breaks on long walks. But I wasn't worried. Not the way I used to be. Worry requires a future. I was living in the moment. One morning, I sat by the edge of a cliff overlooking the ocean. The sky was gray, the water loud. I pulled out my phone and hit record. "If you're hearing this," I said. I made it a little further, maybe not as far as I wanted, but far enough to forgive myself, her, life. I paused, listening to the wind. Don't be angry at endings. Be grateful for the middles. When I came home, the house didn't hurt. It was still, but it wasn't empty, because I had filled it with my own voice again. I didn't play music. I didn't pour a drink. I just sat in my favorite chair and let the silence speak. And for the first time in a long time, I understood it. It wasn't asking me to grieve. It was inviting me to rest. It happened on a Tuesday. Funny how the biggest moments in life never check the calendar. I woke up feeling heavy. Not tired. Not sick. Just slowed. Like something inside had decided it was time to settle down. The sunrise was pale through the window. I sat on the porch with my coffee and watched the neighborhood stretch itself awake. Birds chirped like they didn't know what kind of day it would be. Maybe they did. Maybe I was the only one who didn't. My heart had been playing tricks on me lately. Skipping beats, racing at rest, growing quiet when it should have roared. I knew what it meant. I'd known for a while. You don't live with a bad heart this long without learning to read the signs. I called Rena that morning. "I think I'm close," I told her. She didn't speak right away. Then, softly, "Do you want to talk about what comes next?" "I think I've made peace with it." We spoke for 20 minutes. She said she'd check in again tomorrow. I didn't tell her not to bother. That afternoon I made a list. Nothing dramatic. Just a list of things I wanted to see one more time. The pier. The tree swing in the park. The bookstore with the creaky floor. The coffee shop with the mural on the ceiling. I visited each one. Sat in silence. Smiled when I could. Let the weight of the years rest on my shoulders like a coat I was finally ready to take off. At the bookstore, I bought a novel I'd always meant to read. At the cafe, I tipped the barista more than the bill. At the park, I swung gently in the breeze until my legs ached. Life was quieter now, but it still had music. You just had to listen closer. Back home, I wrote letters. Not many, just enough. One for my sister. One for Rena. One for a friend I hadn't spoken to in years. And one for Marla. I didn't make her the villain. I didn't turn our story into a tragedy. I told her I was grateful for the good years. That I forgave her, not out of sainthood, but because I no longer wanted to carry her with me into whatever came next. I ended the letter with a line I once heard in a song. Some loves don't last forever, but they made the road a little softer. That night, I didn't go to bed right away. I sat outside, wrapped in a blanket, breathing the spring air like it was a gift. And maybe it was. The sky was clear. The stars were modest but present. I thought about my parents, my childhood dog, the first time I saw snow, the first time I kissed someone, the way Marla used to hum when she didn't think I was listening. Everything was still inside me, even the things I thought I'd lost. At some point, I drifted to sleep in the chair. I didn't feel the shift. I didn't hear the warning. I didn't wake up, but I didn't need to, because I left in peace. And when they found me the next morning, they said I looked like I just stepped into a dream. The note I left for whoever came first simply said, "I loved, I lost, and I forgave. Don't remember how I left. Remember how I stayed." It was Marla who found him. Not because anyone called. Not because she expected anything. She had taken a wrong turn on her way to the library and felt a strange pull to drive down his street. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was something else. But when she saw the newspaper still on the porch in the afternoon light, her stomach sank. She knocked, then rang the bell. Nothing. The blinds were still open from the day before. She walked to the back, looked through the glass doors, and saw him, still peaceful, wrapped in a blanket like he was waiting for the stars to blink out. When the paramedics arrived, they confirmed what her eyes already knew. Eron was gone. The officer who took her statement said, "He went peacefully." People hope for that, you know? Marla nodded. But inside, she was screaming. Not for attention. Not for pity. For time. Time to go back and change things she never thought would matter this much. The news reached Rena next. A mutual friend in the neighborhood called her. "I knew it was coming," she said quietly. "But you never really know until it's here." She went to the house that evening and sat on his porch, staring at the stars like he did. She didn't cry. She journaled. 3 pages. A letter to him she would never send. She left it folded under a flower pot next to his chair. Inside, the letters he wrote were found addressed in clean, deliberate handwriting. One for her. One for his sister. One for a friend no one could quite place until later. And one for Marla. The funeral was simple. No fanfare. Just like he wanted. A handful of people who knew the real him. People who didn't need a grand speech to understand who he was. The pastor read his final note aloud at the graveside. It was short. Be kind. Carry light. Love even when it's hard. Especially then. Weeks passed. Seasons began to change. Life did what it always does, moved on. But something of him stayed. Marla found herself walking through the same bookstore he loved, running her fingers along spines he once read. She donated all her art to a local hospice center, hanging it in quiet rooms where people said goodbye. It was the only way she knew how to give back. She visited the park bench he loved. Left a photo of him there once. Someone took it. She didn't mind. Rena published a book, a collection of essays and letters, reflections from the people Eron touched. She called it While the Heart Still Speaks. In the foreword, she wrote, "This book is not about a broken heart. It's about a man who chose to live fully even as his heart faded. He didn't roar into eternity. He whispered. And yet we all heard it. His sister created a scholarship in his name for students with chronic illnesses. She never told anyone, but she read his letter every year on the anniversary of his passing. And Marla? She changed. Not overnight. Not loudly. But steadily. She volunteered at a local clinic offering free art classes to teens recovering from loss. She stopped chasing gallery lights. Stopped trying to be someone else's masterpiece. One evening, while packing up her supplies, a student asked her, "Do you believe in soulmates?" Marla paused. "I think sometimes we meet people who shape us. That's rarer than love. That's forever even when it ends." There's a tree planted near Eron's bench now. Just a sapling. Underneath it, a small bronze plaque reads, "He stayed when it mattered, and left when it was time." Legacy isn't about statues or speeches. Sometimes it's a soft breeze through open windows. A favorite mug left untouched. A journal filled with quiet truths. A heart that couldn't lie and chose not to. Eron's story didn't end when he died. It echoed. Through every person who loved him. Through every letter he wrote. Through every act of quiet dignity that he never asked to be thanked for. His final wish wasn't to be remembered loudly. Just honestly. And he was.